Hey, I'm Ben Graham. This is our lecture on money. And it's a fun one, right? Because we get to think about like, what is money and why is it that I can walk into a store with a few pieces of paper and walk out with just about whatever I want? I mean, I can take an envelope full of little pieces of money, little pieces of paper. I can walk into a car dealership and drive away in a new car. That's bonkers. Why will the car dealership accept an envelope full of slips of paper in exchange for a car, right? So, this is the lecture where we get to explore why that works. Okay, so if we ask this question of what is money, we're going to start with defining money by what it does. What can, we tell whether something is money or not money based on what that thing can do. So money, we want to have, in order to call something money, it needs to be able to do three things, right? We want it to be, first of all, a medium of exchange, right? So a medium of exchange means it facilitates transaction between a buyer and a seller. Right? So barter is super inefficient. It's, this is, if I want to buy a pair of shoes, I go down to the cobbler and I say, I would like some shoes. And the cobbler says, well, I actually don't have anything to feed my family for dinner tonight. So I would like 2 pounds of beef in exchange for this pair of shoes. And I say, okay, but I don't have any beef. Like I actually, like I'm a cloth weaver, so I have a bunch of yards of cloth. So now I go over to the butcher and I say, hey, would you like cloth? And you try to trade cloth for the meat, so then you can trade meat for the shoes, right? So what money does is it releases us from something called the dual incidence of wants. In order for barter to work, I have to want what you have, and you have to want what I have, right? And so we need, and what's nice about money is that in order to make an exchange, it's only the case that you have to have what I want. I don't also have to have what you want. I have money, right? And everybody wants money. So I just have to find the person who has the thing I want to buy and I can go buy it. I don't also have to have the thing that they happen to want, right? So it gets much more efficient if we have this medium of exchange, something that everybody will accept in exchange for goods and services. Okay. First thing we need money for, medium of exchange. Second thing, we need it to be a unit of account, right? We want to be able to keep track of, credits and debits, expenditures, to add it up to say $1, $2, $3, $4, and have that be meaningful, right? To be able to keep the books with this, right? If we, for example, were using something as a medium of exchange that were kind of irregular in size or irregular in quantity or in quality, so that we couldn't kind of count them up and have that be meaningful, then that would get in the way of sort of our ability to keep the books with these things. Okay. We also want our money to be a stable store of value, right? So a really nice thing about money, before we're going to call something money, it needs to be able to store value over time, which is to say, if you pay me money today and I hang on to it for a few days or a week or even a year, I should be able to take that money and go spend it, right? That it should still have value later, right? And so what's really nice is this is like intertemporal exchange, right? So it means that I can save with it, I can lend with it, I can borrow it with it, right? So if it is both a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value, that's when then I can use it for lending and borrowing and that sort of thing, right? That's when it becomes a method of deferred payment, right? So you can use it to pay debts back later. If it's a medium of exchange, then everybody's willing to accept it, right? If it's a unit of account and a stable store of value, then I can add up how much my debt is, and I can promise to pay you back later. And that amount that I'm promising to pay you later is likely to have value in the future, right? So, okay, so if anything can do all four of these things, right? And if you can do the first three, then you can do the fourth. So if we have something that can do all these things, then we have money. So money can be many different things, right? So historically, here are a few different things that have been used for money. We'll sort of start with the thing you're most familiar with. We'll talk with paper money, right? But historically, that's the most recent, right? So this is fiat currency. Before fiat currency, there were a lot of national currencies issued on the basis of gold, and gold was used directly as a medium of exchange and a unit of account, so many ounces of gold. And we had purity, so you had 18 karat, 24 karat, right? So we had purity measures and amounts, and we could use it as a unit of account. We could use it for stored value, right? Gold held value over time. Okay. Slightly more historical and maybe less familiar to you. So we have wampum beads used as a form of currency by Native American tribes. And so these, these are beads stitched together, right? And they're very time consuming to make, and they do vary in quality, but they were able to be used as a pretty widely accepted medium of exchange, right? And they're reasonable as a unit of account, depending on sort of the size. There's more variation in qualities. It's not a perfect unit of account. And you didn't see a lot of, didn't see as much sort of kind of debt and lending in wampum as you do in some other currencies, right? But you see them used as a medium of exchange quite widely. And then here, this is my favorite. These are my favorite ones on this slide here. These are rye wheels, which are used as a form of money on the island of Yap. And so these are giant stone wheels, and they are actually not mined on the island of Yap, but they're actually mined at another island a short distance away. And so it takes a lot of time and energy to mine these things and to carve them out. And then you load them onto these canoes, onto sort of a couple of canoes strapped together, and you have to transport them back to the island of Yap. So the supply is really limited, right? Because it's really labor intensive to get these things. But then they are this medium of exchange. Obviously, these are pretty large things, so they're not super divisible, and they were used for large transactions, things like dowries. And it's interesting because they were also very hard to move. It's also the case that sometimes, there'd be an oral history of who this rye wheel belonged to. So it might be this rye wheel might be sitting in one person's yard, but everybody in the village knows it actually belongs to the neighbor, right? Due to a transaction that occurred a decade ago. So sometimes they would use these in transactions and not even physically move them, but just transfer ownership while leaving the stone wheel in place. Okay, so we can use a lot of different things as money. And so, why is it that money has value? Why is it that people accept any of these things, a rye wheel, a set of wampum beads, or a little piece of paper as a medium of exchange? Why will people give you goods and services in exchange for these things? And so if we think about why money has value, we're going to go back to, right, what's the foundation of pretty much everything we talked about in this class? It's supply and demand, right? So money is just a commodity, and its value is determined by supply and demand. So first we'll talk about what drives the demand for money. So the demand for money is determined by the amount of goods and services available for purchase, right? So if there are a lot of goods and services floating around in the economy, then money has a lot of value because there's a lot of stuff I can exchange for that money, right? So if you hold the money supply constant and now there's a bunch of goods and services, the same amount of money will buy more goods and services than if we're in a time when goods and services are really scarce and the money supply is constant. Now each dollar doesn't buy as much as it used to, right? So holding the supply of money constant, the more goods and services are circulating in the economy, the more is being produced, the higher GDP is, then the higher the value of that currency, right? And the other thing that really affects the demand for money is people's faith in its ability to hold its value, right? And this, goes back to when we were talking about things that can affect the demand for any product, is expectations about future demand, right? Can affect demand and price in the present, right? And so if somebody expects that this money is not going to be a stable store of value, right? That it's going to lose value in the future, then I'm less willing to give you goods and services for it now, right? I have a lower demand, a lower willingness to pay or exchange for this money. So faith in the ability to hold value and how many goods and services are out there that you can buy with this money. That's what's going to drive demand. But what drives the supply of money? And that's very different for these different types of money that we just talked about. So the supply of gold is determined by how much of it we can find and get out of the ground, right? So this isn't like driven by governmental decision making, right? You guys may have watched, there's some reality shows out there right now about gold mining and about sort of speculation and investments in gold mining. The supply of rye wheels, right? It's determined by how many of those wheels the islanders have time and energy to go mine at the next door island and carry back on these canoes, right? So it's sort of the willingness of the villagers to provide this labor, their capacity to do that drives the supply. The supply of paper money, when we get to fiat currency, that's determined by how much the Fed, in the US case, the Federal Reserve is our central bank. In other countries, the central bank has different names, but the Federal Reserve, the US Federal Reserve Bank is our central bank. So the supply of US dollars is determined by how much the Fed decides to print. So it's a government decision. It's also determined by something that's not a government decision exactly, but that government decisions bear on, as we'll discuss, which is how fast that money circulates. And this is something that the government partially controls, but not entirely. So how much you print and then how fast that circulates. Because if it's circulating really quickly, meaning that like the dollar I spend at the convenience store, then the convenience store owner takes that money and spends it that afternoon on a burrito. And then the guy, the person who owns the taco truck, then takes that money and goes and buys a haircut that evening. And then the barber takes that money and goes out to the nightclub and buys a drink that night. You know, like you could have $1 bill that gets spent 5 or 6 times in a day, right? So velocity and the amount that's there are going to determine the supply of money. Okay. So how do we measure the money supply? How do we even know how much is out there, right? So if we've got 2 factors here, how much the Fed has printed, right? Or in any country, how much the central bank has printed, and then how fast it's circulating. So what we do is we count up the money that's out there in the economy and we break it into tranches based on how fast that particular type of money tends to circulate. So we're dividing up money according to how liquid it is, meaning how easy it is to spend. And the easier it is to spend, the faster it's likely to be circulating. So M0 is the cash in circulation. And, you know, and I gave that example of how a dollar bill can be spent multiple times in the same day, right? So it's really easy for me to receive a dollar in a transaction and turn right around and spend that dollar again. MB is M0 plus cash that's sitting in bank vaults and Federal Reserve Bank credits. These are quite liquid. They're very easy for the banks to spend and lend out, but they're not quite like a dollar bill that's going to be transacted multiple times in a day, right? And then you've got M1, which is MB and M0 plus money that's sitting in checking accounts, right? Because I can spend that right away. I can spend that today. But if I hand somebody a check at the barber, that barber then has to go to their bank and turn it into cash or deposit it before they can go out and spend it. There's kind of this intermediate step that doesn't exist if I paid cash for my haircut and then the barber can turn around and immediately go use that to buy lunch or buy dinner or whatever, right? Okay. So then M2 is M1, which is sort of like the checking, everything comes before that, plus money that's sitting in savings accounts, money that's sitting in certificates of deposit, which given that you guys have kind of come of financial age in a time of very low interest rates, you may not have any experience with certificates of deposit, but these are essentially like deposits in a bank where you're promising to leave the money in the bank for 6 months or for 3 years, right? So a fixed time that you're promising to leave the money in savings. And retail money market funds, right? So these aren't as liquid as checking accounts, but these are still types of deposits that the depositor can get back pretty easily, right? So once we get beyond this to other financial assets, things like stocks or bonds, we no longer consider them part of the money supply. Those are financial assets. So these are all the things that we sort of consider to be part of the money supply. And so measuring the money supply, we'll kind of have different, we'll say, what's the M0? What's the level of M0 in the economy right now? What's the level of M1? What's the level of M2? Yeah, so there's not really one number that we throw on the money supply. We throw multiple numbers on it. Okay. All right, so that's sort of supply and demand for money, kind of in broad principles. So let's talk about this idea that we've kind of had an evolution of money from certain things like gold, that we could just use gold directly in transactions, and people are carrying around bags of gold bullion or gold coins that are sort of a fixed weight of gold. And then you move from that to when governments start issuing currencies. Historically, when you get some of the first, well, not some of the first, but some of the more recent, but still, you know, a few hundred years ago, when you've got government issued currencies, many of those are backed by gold. And particularly if you think about the first wave of globalization in the late 1800s, one of the factors that's helping drive that wave of globalization is a bunch of countries all issuing currencies based on the gold standard. So whether it was the British pound, which was the most broadly circulated currency at the time, or the American dollar at the time, or the French franc, right? These were all gold-backed currencies. And so that made it very easy to figure out what's the exchange rate between a franc and a dollar and a pound, because they're all convertible into gold at a fixed rate. So the way the gold standard works is that the government owns a bunch of gold. In the US case, it was sitting in Fort Knox for a while. Now the US still owns some gold, but for some reason it's in a bank vault in Manhattan. Anyway, why we own any at all is a little bit unclear at this point. But when we were on the gold standard, there was a big gold supply that belonged to the US government. And when the government would print a US dollar bill, right, that dollar bill would say on it, essentially, it was very formally an IOU for a certain amount of gold. You could take that dollar bill and you could go to a government bank, you go to the Federal Reserve, and you could exchange that piece of paper for some gold, right? And so these pieces of paper circulated in the economy, but they were all backed by gold. The basic idea is that when you were exchanging this piece of paper, you were exchanging IOUs for gold, promises that the government would give you gold in exchange for that. And so that was why the paper money had value, was because people valued gold, and gold was sitting in a bank vault somewhere, and you could go use your dollar bills to claim that gold. So there's this fixed rate at which you can exchange the dollar bill for gold. And that system works as long as the government has a lot of gold, right? As long as people are confident that the government can indeed afford to accept your dollar bill and give you gold, and then accept this person's dollar bill and give them gold, and that you can do this for anybody who might come to you and ask for gold. As long as the government has enough gold that we trust them to do that, then we have faith in the long run value of the dollar, and we're willing to accept this as a medium of exchange in the present, and we borrow and we lend in dollars, and the whole system works. But it works, key thing, it works as long as the government has lots of gold. Okay. And so that means that the money supply in the economy is actually tied back to the supply of gold in the economy. And eventually we'll see that this gets to be a bit of a problem, right? Okay, but that's a couple slides ahead of us. I want to talk right now, I want to anchor us with the words inflation and deflation, because these actually, as much as these are words that are in your vocabulary already, it's easy to get turned around with these concepts. Once we're talking about supply and demand for money and the value of money, inflation and deflation, it's actually easy to get flipped up on it. So let's talk, so inflation, right? When we have inflation, we're talking actually about a decrease in the value of money over time. And deflation is an increase in the value of money over time. And that's where it's easy to get twisted up. And in inflation, right? So if inflation is increasing, right, which means that the value of money is going down over time, and it's going down more and more rapidly over time, that's really good for you if you're in debt, right? Because it means that you borrowed money, and let's say you borrowed $100,000 today. And today that $100,000 is worth 4 Honda Civics, right? But let's say we have a bunch of inflation and the value of dollars goes down dramatically, gets cut in half. Now that $100,000 is only worth 2 Honda Civics. So you owe the bank $100,000, and actually probably owe them some interest, so you owe them $110,000. But now the $100,000 is only worth 2 Honda Civics, so you owe them 2.1 Honda Civics. So they gave you an amount of money worth 4 Honda Civics. Now you're giving them back an amount of money that's worth 2.1 Honda Civics. Wow, that's a really good deal for you, right? And so but it's also really bad if you have savings, right? Because let's say you took that $100,000 and you put it in a savings account, right? And that's your life savings. You worked really hard to earn all that money, and you earned money worth 4 Honda Civics. But now you're retired and you go to draw on your savings to cover your expenses. And now your savings are no longer worth 4 Honda Civics. They're only worth 2 Honda Civics, right? And what I'm doing here, I'm converting dollars into something real, into real items, into purchasing power, right? That's how we sort of think about the value of money, is what can you buy with it? Whether it's Honda Civics or pizzas or whatever our unit is of what is the real thing I eventually want to consume at the end of the day. Okay. So increases in inflation are good for you if you're in debt and bad for you if you have savings, right? And decreases in inflation, if we have negative inflation, we call that deflation of a currency, when the currency is actually increasing in value over time, which is fairly rare in the modern system, but it's something that we had in Japan for a while in the 90s. These are really bad for you if you're in debt, right? It means that your debt is getting more and more valuable over time, means that the money, that you paid back $100,000 that was when you borrowed, it was worth 4 Honda Civics. Now when you go to pay it back, it's worth 6 Honda Civics. So you have to earn enough money to be able to pay back 6 Honda Civics worth of dollars. So it gets harder and harder to pay your debts back over time if we have deflation going on. But it's really good for you if you have savings, right? Your money's just sitting there under the mattress getting more and more valuable over time, right? So deflation is really nice for you if you have savings and if you're planning on living off those savings later in your life or something. Okay, and then the other thing to keep in mind is that, and we'll talk about real versus nominal interest rates here in just a moment, right? But so the idea is like, if I can predict what the inflation rate is going to be, then I can predict what the value of dollars is going to be in a future year, right? That makes it really easy to write these intertemporal contracts, to write these lending contracts where I give you money today and you pay me back in 5 years or 10 years, right? I mean, right now I have a 30-year mortgage on my house, which is kind of a bonkers contract to write in the world, right? That I'm making promises about how much money I'm going to pay the bank 30 years from now. So the bank and I both have to think that we have a pretty good idea of what the US dollar is going to be worth 30 years from now when we enter into this contract. If we have no idea what inflation is going to do, if it's going to go up for a while and then down for a while and then up for a while and then down for a while, if it's going to bounce all over the place, it's really hard for the bank and it's really hard for me to even wrap my head around what am I agreeing to when I sign this 30-year mortgage contract, right? And so that inability to project to the future, that inability to plan makes it pretty much impossible to enter into long-term lending contracts. So you'll see that in countries that have really volatile currencies with lots of, with inflation swinging wildly up and down, you're not going to see a lot of long-term lending contracts denominated in that currency, right? So in order to get long-term lending, you need a stable currency, which means you don't want interest rate volatility. So one of the policy goals of a central bank is generally stable inflation. And we'll talk in a little bit about why you actually don't want zero inflation, but you want low and predictable inflation. That's usually a goal of a central bank, is low but predictable inflation. Okay. Now, if you have really high inflation, volatile or not, if you just have high inflation, let's say you've got 10% a year or something like that, pretty high. So when I say like low inflation, I'm saying 2% a year. It's kind of that would be low, stable inflation. Like in the US, the Federal Reserve target is 2 to 3% inflation per year. That's kind of, that would be low and stable. It's staying like, okay, it's 2% this year, 2.5% next year, 2.1 this year, 2.7 next year. That would be the Fed doing their job really well with regard to inflation and having stable, low inflation. But 10% a year, something like that, that gets hard to manage. And hyperinflation, sometimes you'll see thousands of percent a year. So when inflation is high, money is a crummy store of value, right? So if inflation was 10, 20% a year, then US dollars are not holding their value well year over year. If you've got 10% inflation per year, 6 or 7 years from now, my money is only worth half of what it used to be, right? So the value erodes really, really quickly. And so what you'll get is you've got a lot of inflation, then nobody wants to hold on to money. What you want to do if you're facing a lot of inflation is or you're scared of inflation, is you want to go out and you want to buy things of value. So when I was in the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan, at the time I was there from like 2004 to 2006, the Turkmen manat was worth about 25,000 Turkmen manat to $1, right? Now, I can't remember, it was the mid 90s when the currency was introduced. And when it was introduced, so that had only been, 10 years, 12 years prior. Actually the currency was probably about 10 years old when I was there, since it had been formally introduced. And when it was introduced 10 years prior, it had been at 1 manat to $1. So you'd gone from if you had your life savings was $25,000 and you put that all in manat, in 1994, and then 10 years later in 2004, when I show up joining the Peace Corps, that your whole life savings that used to be $25,000 is now worth $1, right? You've lost your whole life savings, right? So they'd had this period of hyperinflation. They'd had that experience. And so people didn't trust the value of the manat. At the time I was there, it was pretty stable, It's actually stable the whole 2 years I was there. But people had this recent history of hyperinflation that was very much on their mind. And so people didn't hold on to Turkmen manat. What they did is they either converted, if they had some savings, they converted their manat into US dollars and hid those under their floorboards. That was one strategy. Or they took their manat and they spent it, they bought a cow or they bought a car. They bought some asset that was likely to hold its value over time, right? Okay, so you don't hang on to money if you're worried you're going to have inflation, right? Because you hang on to it for a year and suddenly it's worth half of what it was right now, right? That's a really scary prospect. So you don't want to hang on to money. In periods of hyperinflation, people will demand to be paid daily, right? Not paid every 2 weeks, because by 2 weeks from now, the money that I earned this, today is almost useless. And people would be paid and they would immediately go to the store and spend it, right? Because by tomorrow, money might be worth half as much as it was worth today, like in these periods of extreme hyperinflation. So people, you don't hang on to cash. You get it and you spend it immediately. Okay, so the higher inflation is, the less you hang on to money. Deflation, on the other hand, causes savings and hoarding, right? If you think that your money is going to be worth more tomorrow than it is today, well, why spend it today? Just wait tomorrow and you can buy even more of it, right? And so then everybody takes their money and shoves it under their mattress and nobody's spending and nobody's investing, and that's terrible for the economy. And this is why the goal for central banks tends to be stable but low inflation. You want to give people enough inflation that it gives them an incentive to take that money out from under their mattress and invest it somewhere, spend it somewhere. You don't want super high inflation where they're panicked and unloading the money, but you also don't want people just shoving their money under the mattress and waiting for it to be more valuable later. You want that money in circulation. You want people buying and investing. And so if you have deflation, it disincentivizes people from doing things like buying stocks and whatever. They'll just stick their money in a savings account. You want people taking risks, making investments with their money. So, the basic idea, sort of the consensus among economists, is that 2 to 3% is about right to incentivize people to get their money out there into the economy. But if it's stable 2 to 3%, it also allows us to write these long-term lending contracts like the 30-year mortgage that I used to buy a house. Okay. So the Federal Reserve in the United States has what we call a dual mandate. They have two things that they're supposed to manage. They're supposed to manage the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, right? So they're supposed to be keeping inflation at about 2 to 3% a year, right? So they have that target, but they're also trying to keep us as close as possible to full employment, which economists used to think was kind of in the 4 to 5% range, and now we think is maybe below 4%. For quite a while, there was an empirical regularity where when inflation was really high, unemployment tended to be pretty low because nobody was hanging on to money. So everybody was spending it and everybody was investing it, and that would get the economy going. That would get economic growth going when you had high inflation. Whereas if we had really low inflation, everybody's saving, everybody's kind of hoarding, nobody's investing, so nobody's hiring, and we'd have relatively high employment. So we had this, so the Fed was trying to take care of two things, and those two things were historically viewed as generally moving in opposite directions and being, to a certain extent, opposed to one another. You guys are living in an era where most of the discussion among economists is the Phillips curve temporarily broken or permanently broken, right? Because this is an empirical relationship that just has not been holding lately. Inflation and unemployment do not seem to be kind of like moving opposite one another in any sort of reliable way in recent years. So the Phillips curve is in some sense like really important for understanding the history of the Federal Reserve and the history of monetary policy in the United States over the last half century. But it is not particularly important for understanding the monetary policy decisions being made today by the Federal Reserve, because at the moment, this curve, which is just an empirical approximation based on a few decades of data, that empirical regularity doesn't hold at the moment. Okay. So you've got a Federal Reserve or a central bank in any country with a fiat currency that is kind of targeting low and stable inflation, right? So 2 to 3% inflation. So what are the causes of inflation and deflation? So you're going to end up with deflation if the money supply is increasing more slowly than the supply of goods and services, right? So if the price of money is set by supply and demand is being driven by how many goods and services are out there to buy, if demand is increasing faster than supply, then the price is going to rise, right? So the value of money is going to rise, which is deflation, right? And one of the most famous political speeches in US history, excuse me, is an 1896 speech given at the Democratic Convention by the person who went on to become the Democratic nominee for president that year, William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan ended up losing the presidential election to William McKinley, not one of our better known presidents. But the speech from the convention that year is probably better known than the whole McKinley presidency, right? Which is this Cross of Gold speech. And it was a speech about bimetallism, of all things, about whether or not we should have a US dollar that's on the gold standard, or whether the US dollar should be backed not just by gold, but also by silver, should have two different metals behind it rather than just gold. And so the reason, and William Jennings Bryan advocated for bimetallism, for adding silver as a second metal that would back US dollars. And what that would allow the government to do, the reason Bryan wanted that to happen is because that was a way to expand the supply of dollars. So if you're on a strict gold standard, the supply of dollars in the system is limited by how much gold you can mine. And at the time, in the late 1800s, right, the U.S. Economy had been growing really quite fast, from like 1970 up through 1891, the 1890, right? That first wave of globalization, we had a period of pretty rapid economic growth in the United States. And so the economy was expanding faster than the supply of gold. And we were getting deflation. And one of the groups that was hit hardest by deflation were the farmers, right? And so because farmers tended to take out loans to buy their seed and equipment and whatever, and so they'd spend money all through this spring and summer, right? And then they'd harvest in the fall and pay back the debt, right? But if you had deflation, paying back those debts was harder. And so the 1896 Cross of Gold speech, the last line of the speech was that, Bryan would not allow mankind to be crucified on a cross of gold, right? And this was, William Jennings Bryan is a famous populist, and sort of this idea that economic policy needed to serve the common person and not serve the rich and the elite, and in this case, the bankers. So the bankers who held a bunch of debt did not want to see inflation, right? And Bryan wanted to see inflation sort of on behalf of a whole lot of indebted farmers, right? Okay. So, the flip side of if the supply of money is increasing slower than GDP is increasing, we're going to get deflation. Whereas if the money supply is increasing faster than the supply of goods and services, we get inflation. And this is really common with fiat currencies. And actually, I realize this is a word I've used once already in the lecture and I haven't defined for you yet. And a fiat currency is something like the US dollar in modern times, where it is not exchangeable for any good or service at a fixed rate, right? It's not exchangeable for anything else at a fixed rate. So when you're on the gold standard, you're not a fiat currency, right? In that case, your paper money is an IOU for a specific amount of gold. It is exchangeable for gold at a fixed rate. If you've moved to a fiat currency, and in a couple of slides, we're talking about kind of the historical progress in the US toward a fiat currency. We're sort of moving in that direction right now. But with a fiat currency, that dollar bill or that yen or that euro is not exchangeable for anything else at a fixed rate. It's not on the gold standard. It's not on the silver standard. It's not, right? There's no clear promise what you can get for this thing, right? And in the case of fiat currencies, it's very tempting for the government to print too much money and to expand the money supply too much and lead to hyperinflation. Right? So this is a real risk with fiat currencies, which we will talk about. And to talk about sort of why governments might be tempted to print too much money, we have to use this concept of seigniorage. And seigniorage is just the difference between the face value of money and its cost of production. And so you go back to some of like the earliest coinage, the earliest government issued money. What all the government was doing when they were printing gold coins is they were essentially standardizing weights. They were certifying that this coin holds exactly, for example, 1 ounce of gold or half an ounce of gold, right? So with the stamp of the monarch's face, the issuing authority was certifying that that coin held a specific amount of gold at a specific purity level. But the coin itself was made of gold. So the cost of producing that coin was the same as the value of the coin, right? And so the government didn't reap a lot of value from printing those coins. However, if you look at the US $100 bill, that cost the US Federal Reserve a few cents to print. And so let's say it costs the Federal Reserve 5 cents to print. But when the Federal Reserve first prints it, it comes off the printing press. The US government, they don't then take this $100 bill and go drop it out of the sky from a helicopter and let somebody pick it up and spend it. No, the US government spends it. The US government buys $100 worth of goods and services for it. And so the US government just spent 5 cents to print it and now acquired $100 worth of goods and services for it. So their seigniorage, the profit essentially from this transaction for the US government is $99.95, right? Super valuable. Really, really nice thing to do. So you can understand why it's really tempting as a government to print too much money, right? You're like, I need to buy a bunch of goods and services. I could either tax my citizens, which is going to slow economic growth and make my citizens really annoyed with me, or I could just turn the crank on this handy dandy printing press over here. I think I'll turn the crank on this handy dandy printing press, right? And so the temptation for governments to just print money to buy what they want is really, really high. Okay, so that's kind of the risk of the fiat currency, which I want to have kind of sitting in the back of your head as we talk about kind of how we got there in the United States. So the US was on the gold standard up through World War II. We were just straight on the gold standard. And then after World War II, and we will be talking a lot in this class about a conference that took place at a ski resort in New Hampshire in 1946, a ski resort called Bretton Woods, which is not a particularly famous ski resort anymore, but is mostly famous for kind of being the birthplace of the modern economic system that the second wave of globalization was sort of built under, and to a large extent, which still governs the global economy. So after World War II, trade is starting to grow really quickly, right? And the supply of gold was not growing as fast as global trade. And the global economy was starting to pick up steam, right? So there's lots of goods and services out there that you can buy with currency, with gold, with all these gold-backed currencies. But the supply of gold is not growing particularly fast at this time. And nobody wanted deflation, right? Because deflation is going to lead to a bunch of saving and hoarding instead of investment, and we're going to choke off economic growth if we have a bunch of deflation, so we don't want that. So at this ski resort in New Hampshire, where you have kind of the economic representatives of kind of the victorious powers in World War II, there was a decision reached and actually pushed very hard by a pretty obscure Treasury Department official at the time, over the interests of John Maynard Keynes, who is a very famous economist sort of advocating for on the British behalf. The British wanted the pound to be the international reserve currency. The Americans wanted the dollar. The Americans were the more powerful party at the time and were able to get the US dollar installed as the international reserve currency. And so what happened was that all these other currencies, the British pound, the French franc, the German mark, so on and so forth, in 1946, there wasn't a German mark because you still had the separated Germany. They didn't have their own currency yet, but that came along later. But anyway, the French franc certainly. So you had a bunch of global currencies that switched from being strictly on the gold standard to being backed by a combination of gold and dollars, right? So now they're not, they're sort of halfway to being fiat currencies. They're exchangeable for something else at a fixed rate, but one of those other things is another currency. So we're kind of two steps, so we're on the gold standard, but we're one step removed, which is really nice for the US, right? Tremendous seigniorage that the US reaped from this. It meant that the US could print dollar bills, $100 bills, $50 bills, send those overseas to sit in bank vaults at other national banks. So they would, and when I say send them over there, I mean use them to buy goods and services from those countries. Then those dollar bills are going into the bank vaults of those countries and sitting there as backing for their currencies. So we get to reap all the seigniorage by printing all these dollar bills and shipping them overseas. And by 1965, we've done a lot of this. We've reaped a lot of seigniorage, and there are more dollars sitting overseas than there is gold in US reserves. So, we're kind of like at the system where it's like, okay, this system seems to work okay, but if everybody overseas at once decided to cash in all their dollars for gold, right? And at that time, the US dollar was still exchangeable for a fixed amount of gold. We promised, if they all came and asked for their gold at once, we would not be able to give it to them. Not only, and there was more overseas than there was gold, not to mention all the dollars circulating in the US economy, right? So there was way more dollar bills out there than there was gold sitting in US vaults. So this system was like, I don't know if this is really tenuous. Like, are people going to keep faith that we can actually exchange gold for all these dollar bills when clearly we cannot if everybody asks at once? So this system's kind of, people are starting to sort of worry a little bit about how this is going to go. And, I'm sort of shortchanging the historical debate here. But in 1971, Nixon announces that the US just won't redeem dollars for gold anymore. It's just like, how that's like the whole premise of the global monetary system? Yeah, we're just not going to do that anymore. If you come to us with a dollar bill and ask for gold, we're just going to say no. Right? So we said, now dollar bills are not worth anything in particular, right? And remember, the world had never had a monetary system that worked like that. And there were a lot of dire predictions. Fortunately, this turned out to be a little bit like Y2K, which I realize is before you all were born, which is kind of terrifying. But there was a concern, in like 1998, 1999, that when we flipped over to the year 2000, the computers would read that as the year 0 instead of the year 2000, and that would throw, airline traffic into chaos and all this stuff. Turned out that, the millennium turned and everything was just fine. And that mostly is what happened with the switch to the US dollar being a fiat currency, and then by extension, a bunch of these other global currencies being fiat currencies, that the dollar no longer had any intrinsic value, wasn't exchangeable for anything else at a fixed rate, but the global economy just kind of shrugged and said, okay, but I think we're just going to keep accepting these because we've already been doing it and everybody else is doing it, so I'll keep doing it and it'll all be fine, right? But once you're on a fiat currency, the reason this thing has value is because I believe that other people believe that it has value, right? And so this all becomes just a system of mutual insanity, right? Like, as long as I believe that you believe that this has value, then I will value it, right? And so it's just recursive social expectations is what sustains the value of a fiat currency. And since 1971 to the present, so for the last 50 years, this has worked very well. And it means that that central banks can control the supply of money, right? If the economy is growing really fast, we can print a bunch of money. If the economy slows down and we don't want to have too much inflation, then we can adjust accordingly, right? So we can print more or less money, and as we'll talk about, we can control the velocity of money through some other mechanisms as well. Okay. So what happened when we moved to fiat currencies is we sort of disconnected the supply of money globally from the supply of gold globally. Like, as long as we were on the gold standard, which held for a very long time, right, became very common in the mid to late 1800s and stayed, as the backbone of the global monetary system up until 1971, right? But the value of gold over time was really unstable. And you'll see it really hits its nadir right before the U.S. goes off the gold standard, and then it spikes right after that, and then it kind of chills out and goes up, right? But you had these wild swings over time, and it's something completely outside the control of governments. And if you want to look, you'll see, like, this is sort of a 100-year chart, and it ends almost 10 years ago. So here's the last 10 years. And so you continue to see, a lot of volatility in this. And that used to be, as the value of gold is going like this, that's what's happening to the global monetary supply. That is inflation and deflation, which is pretty volatile, right? And, so what we want is this stable, low inflation. If the value of money is just the value of gold, then we don't have the stability that we'd really like in the global economy. If, it's hard to, if you're writing lending contracts in ounces of gold, right? But you have this kind of volatility in the price of gold, it makes it really hard to like lend and borrow in gold, right? Okay, so it's much nicer to have these fiat currencies. So having the value of your money track the value of gold can be less than ideal. So it's nice to have governments in control of it, but that doesn't mean that governments always get this right. And this goes back to sort of these concerns about independence of the central bank, right? So here's what happens when governments lose control of the value of their currency, or when they give in to this temptation just to print a bunch of money to solve the problems that they're in, right? So after World War I, Germany owed a lot of reparations to the countries that they had lost the war to. And in part to pay those reparations, they simply printed money. And so you had periods of hyperinflation in Germany. And here we have the 1 billion mark note, and we have some children using bricks of currency, like sort of stacks of money, as building blocks because they are cheaper than actual building blocks. And then we have a more recent example below, a somewhat famous, the $100 trillion note from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. This dates from a period of hyperinflation in 2008 and 2009. You know, and after this period of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, the government actually stopped issuing official currency in 2009 and eventually demonetized completely. And so now official, you know, there's a range of 7 or 8, I think, different currencies that are official currencies in Zimbabwe, including the US dollar and quite a few others. And the Zimbabwean government does no longer issues their own currency. Fun sort of a side fact: these $1 trillion notes now sell for over $100 a pop on eBay, right? So they've actually become sort of collector's items. So had you grabbed a bunch of these notes in 2009 and held onto them, you would have made a pretty penny on your investment. But this is the temptation of when a government can simply turn the crank and print currency and spend it. When governments are facing crises, this can be their only way out of the crisis, and you can end up in these serious periods of hyperinflation when the value of money is disappearing overnight. All right. One more key concept here that we need to kind of anchor as we're going through this stuff, as we're trying to connect all these different threads together. We need to have this idea about nominal interest rates versus real interest rates. So nominal interest rates is the number that's written down in the lending contract, which is just sort of say, how much do I have to pay you next year? How much do I have to sort of be promising to pay you next year in order to get you to give me money today, right? So that, and the real interest rate is that nominal interest rate minus inflation. Right? Because if the money that I pay you back next year is worth less than the money I borrowed today, right, then I'm not really paying you all that interest. So this is the idea that if I promise to pay you 10% interest, but there is 8% inflation between now and next year, then the real interest rate I'm paying you is only 2%. Because the money I'm paying you back a year from now is only worth 2% more than the money that I borrowed. So it's sort of in real terms, which means in terms of loaves of bread or Honda Civics or large pizzas, right? In terms of the stuff I can buy with this money, how much am I giving you back a year from now relative to how much you gave me today? Okay, and so the higher the expected inflation rate is, then the higher the nominal interest rate today is going to be, right? So if the real interest rate of kind of the amount of that real difference that needs to exist between what I take from you today and what I give you back tomorrow to incentivize you to do this, you know, to give me this money in the first place to cover your risk and all this stuff. If what you need to cover your risk is 3%, but you expect there to be 4% inflation, then the nominal rate we're going to agree on is going to be 7%. But if our expectation of inflations go up, that nominal interest rate is going to go up. If expectations on inflation go down, then the nominal rate is going to go down. Okay, so expected inflation has a really direct effect on what's the nominal interest rate being charged in a market. The higher people expect inflation to be, then the higher interest rates are going to be. Whew. And now we're kind of getting to actually being able to talk about how the Federal Reserve in the United States controls the money supply. Because it's easiest to think about, and I still think it's worth anchoring in your brain the idea that the way the Federal Reserve controls the money supply is they turn the crank on the printing press. How much do they print? And that is one way they do it, but the primary way that the Federal Reserve controls the money supply is actually through controlling the interest rate, through setting the interest rate that, so what the Federal Reserve actually controls is the overnight lending rate between banks. And essentially, what is the rate at which the Federal Reserve Bank will lend money to other banks overnight? And so the Federal Reserve can control that unilaterally. And whatever rate the Federal Reserve will lend to other banks at, then other banks will lend to each other at, and that's going to drive interest rates through the whole economy. And so we're going to go back to this idea about the relationship between inflation and people's behavior, and interest rates and people's behavior, where when interest rates are low, when a bank won't give me much money, won't pay me a lot of interest to stick money in a bank account, then I don't save as much. And when I don't have to pay a lot of interest to borrow money, like right now it is dirt cheap to borrow money in the United States. So you see people borrowing more. It's a great time to take out a second loan on your house and do a remodel or something like that, right? It's really cheap to borrow money. So people are borrowing money. It's really cheap to borrow money to buy a new car, right? So when interest rates are low, people borrow more, right? Money comes out of banks. So money leaves savings accounts. People aren't going to stick it, and it becomes cash in people's hands. Right? The velocity of money increases, and that increases the money supply. So remember, one way for the Fed to increase the money supply is print money, increase the supply of it, and the other is to get that money moving faster, right? And so lowering interest rates is how you get money moving faster. And so usually when the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply in the US, they want to increase the supply of money, which will drive down the supply of dollars. So when the Federal Reserve wants to increase inflation, what they do is they drop the interest rate, and that will generate inflation. Right? Because the flip side of this is that when interest rates are high, people save more. Money leaves people's hands, it leaves M0, goes into banks, becomes MB. The velocity of money slows down, right? And so when the Federal Reserve wants to decrease the money supply, when they want to bring inflation under control, right, reduce inflation, right, they're going to raise the interest rate. And that's going to cause everybody to take the money and stick it in a savings account. It's going to cause people like, you know what, I'm not going to take out a loan right now because interest rates are really high. So I'm going to calm down on that credit card spending. I'm not going to take out the second mortgage to do the remodel right now, right? So people chill out on their spending, and you're going to get some deflation, but you're also probably going to slow down economic growth, right? So there's a lot of talk right now about like what should interest rates be? Right? And the federal government's trying to stimulate economic growth during recession. So they're cutting interest rates pretty much all the way down to zero. Okay. So it's this is a very complex lecture, and we sort of circle through a few things. So let's hit some key points here. So low real interest rates are going to stimulate economic growth, right? Firms borrow money, they build factories with that money. Individuals borrow money and spend it as consumers, right? But these low interest rates are also causing inflation, right? Because we're increasing the money supply. So each dollar doesn't buy quite as much as it used to, right? So we're stimulating growth, but we're also potentially causing inflation. So one of the reasons governments are tempted to print a bunch of money is to get economic growth going. But sometimes if a government is really badly in debt, they may want inflation for its own sake, right? They may want to generate a bunch of inflation so that it is easier to pay back their debt because the real value of their debt decreases. Okay, and so that's something we'll talk about kind of in its own right a little bit as we talk more about government debt. An important goal for kind of monetary policy, right? We talked about wanting this stable, low inflation rate, and we didn't want interest rate volatility. We want things to be super predictable, super boring. One of the ways that you get super predictable, super boring is to have an independent central bank. Right? So in the United States, the Federal Reserve is designed to be politically independent. That the members of the Board of Governors are politically appointed, but once they're appointed, they're pretty much left alone to do their job and set the interest rates. And they have, as I mentioned earlier, this dual mandate: keep inflation low and unemployment low as much as possible, even though these things are sometimes in trade-off with one another. Now, having an independent central bank can be controversial because another word for independent is unaccountable, right? And in a democracy, like we kind of like political actors to be accountable to the voters, but politically independent means not accountable to voters or elected officials, right? And so, so independence can be in contrast to accountability, which is something we tend to value in democracies. Um, so one of the reasons we want, where we might argue that we should have a politically independent central bank is that we might fear that politicians are too willing to trade inflation later for growth and low unemployment now, right? We know that one of the best predictors of whether a president gets reelected is, or whether the president's party wins the next presidential election, if you've got a president who's term limited out, is what the unemployment rate is. That it's a great predictor of how the party in power is going to do in the next election. So we might think that the party in power is going to be way too eager to drop the interest rate, goose the growth rate, bring down unemployment, but then we'll have a bunch of inflation. So we don't necessarily want the politicians in control. So then we make the Fed independent, but then we have concerns about that because they're really powerful and pretty undemocratic. Ron Paul is the senator who's probably over the last decade been the most vocal about, actually for longer than a decade, and now Rand Paul, his son, but Ron Paul for a long time was sort of leading this charge to make the Fed more accountable, right? To audit the Fed, to bring them under more direct political control. But it's also the case that the Federal Reserve makes a good scapegoat. If you're the party in power and the economy isn't growing as fast as you want it to, or you're having a crisis, it's nice to blame somebody other than yourself, and the Federal Reserve can be a nice scapegoat. I think it's worth talking about one kind of historical moment, that this is the moment that most people will point to when they try to explain why it's so important to have, if they're trying to make the argument that it's really important to have a politically independent Federal Reserve. They'll talk about this guy, Paul Volcker, who was a Fed chairman during the Carter administration and in sort of late 70s, early 80s. And so at the time we had a really terrible combination of hyperinflation and high unemployment. And so part of that hyperinflation was driven by high oil prices due to an oil embargo and a few other factors. But we had really high unemployment and really high inflation. And it was really hard to sort of figure out what should monetary policy be. If we're trying to balance these two things, and the Phillips curve says when one of these is high, the other should be low, but now they're both high, what do you do about it? And what Paul Volcker said was, we're going to take care of the inflation issue first, and then we'll be able to take care of the unemployment issue. And so he drove interest rates really high, which did bring inflation down. But in the near term, that kept unemployment really, really high, caused a lot of pain in the economy, made Carter really unpopular. A few different things made Carter unpopular, but that was certainly one of them, very high unemployment, right? And it made Volcker really unpopular for a while. But then he brought down inflation, and then unemployment started to go down, right? The economy started to grow again. And people then in retrospect were like, oh, yeah, that was a really good thing to do. It was really politically hard to do, to pay these short-term, really high costs of very high unemployment for a while. But it got inflation under control, got the economy going again, right? If we'd had that high inflation for a long time, we wouldn't have been able to have the lending and borrowing that we needed to have happen to get investment going again and get the economy going. So people generally credit Paul Volcker with doing a good job of handling that. But they point to him having to do something that was intensely unpopular at the time and saying, hey, look, if we had a Federal Reserve that was democratically accountable to the voters, like in the short term, Volcker never could have done that, right? Okay. Last concept here. I know this is the longest lecture that I probably will record all year. But I think these ideas are all tied into one another enough that I kind of want to put it all the way straight through. So this is talking about good money and bad money. And so we'll talk about bimetallism. So this is circling all the way back to William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold speech, right? And so when we were experimenting with bimetallism in the United States in the early 1890s, there was a ratio of 15 to 1, for a little while 16 to 1. Because the dollar was exchangeable for either metal, right, then that established de facto a ratio between those two metals, right? So, it established a fixed ratio of the value of silver to gold. But remember, you know, the value of silver and gold actually isn't something the government controls by fiat, right? That's controlled by supply and demand, and supply of gold and silver depends on how much it's gold and silver are coming out of the mines every month, right? And so, um, so the US had been experimenting with bimetallism for a while, and particularly in 1849, you have a gold rush. You have a bunch of gold discovered in Alaska and California, and all these silver coins. So when that happens, the value of gold is going down, right? Because the supply is going up. And so in the US, an ounce of silver, it took 15 ounces of silver to be equal to 1 ounce of gold. But sort of the true price in the market was different than that. So people took all these silver coins, melted them down, and shipped the silver overseas, where they could get more gold in exchange for their silver than they could get in the United States, right? So you'll have, what you'll have is you will have bad money driving out good in the economy. This is Gresham's law, right? So this is what's happening in 1849, 1850. And then it's in the 1870s to 1890s where the economy is really booming in that first wave of globalization. Then the supply of gold's expanding too slowly. We have the opposite problem. Then we've got deflation, right? So the key thing here is bimetallism doesn't work because the supply of gold and silver aren't going to move perfectly together, right? And so as long as they're not moving perfectly together, then bimetallism is going to break down, and only one of those types of metal is going to stay in the system. People are going to spend the bad money and hoard the good money. Right? Okay, and this idea of Gresham's law, that people will spend the bad money and hoard the good money anytime you've got sort of two types of money in an economy there. This happens with the Iranian currency, and this is one of the readings that you did for this week, right? So in step one in the Iranian currency crisis, right, people start to worry about the value of the rial, right? They're worrying about the strength of the Iranian economy in the face of a bunch of sanctions, and they're worried that they're going to end up seeing a deflation in the rial. And so people get rid of the rials and exchange them for dollars. So people are selling rial because people are worried about the future value of the rial. People are selling rials into the market and buying up dollars. And because everybody's selling their rials into the market, then the supply of rials in the market is going up. So the price is going down further, and the value of the dollar is rising further because demand for the dollar in the market is going up. Right. So the government is trying to keep the value of the rial high, but this keeps getting harder and harder to do. So as people are dumping their rials, the government has to go into the market and buy up those rials to restore the value. Right, they have to go in because there's so much new supply of rials coming to the market. The government has to come in and be the demand. So they have to sell off their dollars, their dollars that were sitting in reserve, and use it to buy up their own currency. So the government's spending all their foreign reserves buying back their own currency, and the government starts to get worried that they're going to run out of dollars in their foreign reserve, right? And so the government passes a law. They say, okay, no more selling rials. And you can't trade rials or goods for dollars at below an official exchange rate, right? So we're just going to do this by fiat. We're going to, by law, right? We're going to say that you can't exchange rials for anything at below an official exchange rate. And so what you do as soon as you mandate the price of something in this way is you open up a black market. You have sort of the official rate and then the black market exchange rate. And you see this in a lot of places around the world. This will happen. And so what happens is because it's illegal to trade dollars for rials at what they're actually worth, nobody will trade them for rials at all, right? So just dollars go into the mattress, right? So the good money, the more valuable money, vanishes under the mattress, and the bad money is all that will be exchanged. And that means that if I have rials and I'm trying to exchange my rials into dollars so I can buy imported goods, I can't find anybody who will give me dollars at the official rate. So the only way I can get dollars is on the black market. But if I'm like a firm, I can't do that at scale without getting in trouble from the government. So it means that nobody can import goods very efficiently, and you end up with a shortage of imported goods in Iran. And that's sort of what that article walks us through. And I would, I realize that look, today's lecture running all the way through to this example gets pretty complex. So I'd encourage you to maybe watch it a second time and definitely come into our group session with questions. I'm hoping that this will very much be kind of like a question-driven session when we get in here, and we can unstick all these things, because we've gone a long way from like supply and demand for currencies to the value of currencies to inflation and deflation and how governments can control the money supply, to the idea of bimetallism and how you can get official exchange rates and unofficial instead of black market exchange rates. There's a lot of moving pieces to keep together in your head. So let's really kind of spin those through in class all together. What happens at the end of this Iranian example is eventually the government gives up on trying to sustain the value of the real artificially high. They say, like, this just isn't going to work. We have to admit that we've run out of reserves, and we just have to devalue the real. One of the other things you're going to watch in the readings, right, is sort of how this works with the Thai baht during the Asian financial crisis as well. So this is sort of talking about fixed exchange rates and currency crises, which is what we're moving into here. Is we're moving into talking more. This is meant mostly about inflation. We're starting to get into exchange rates, which, so the value of each currency is moving independently, and that affects the exchange rate between the two currencies, which then is what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about financial crises too, which obviously is what we're kind of hinting at or building into with this example. So in order to kind of set us up for this, the last thing I'll cover today is sort of what happens with a devaluation, right? And a devaluation of a currency by any other name is just sudden and discrete inflation, right? So prices go up suddenly, and when prices go up suddenly, you tend to get political unrest, right? Because suddenly people have money that they were planning to use to buy food and things that they need, like right then, suddenly they can't do that, and you'll often get rioting, right? Like this is something that hits everybody at once, right where they feel it. So you get major structural problems in your economy when you have this quick price adjustment, but you're affecting the purchasing power of every citizen in the economy at once. And often you will see riots and that sort of thing. And so, during the Civil War, there were bread riots in the southern United States. And certainly we've seen the role of kind of price shocks on things in protests in the Arab Spring. So this is something that throughout history across a wide range of different countries, currency devaluations and periods of hyperinflation, particularly price increases in staple goods like food, have create a lot of political instability. And so we'll have a lot of once we can really get clean on all of the economic fundamentals that I was running through in this lecture, right? Once we kind of get clean on that, we've got a lot of politics to talk about, right? And financial crises and the way that the International Monetary Fund comes in to bail countries out from financial crises with different conditions on it. There's a lot of really interesting politics to talk about. So let's work really hard to anchor these economic concepts so that then we can talk in a really informed way about those political trade-offs. Thank you all for being with me.